So today we have two really exciting presentations of dissertations that have been completed. These students are preparing to graduate in October, so we've got to get them on the schedule, and they're great projects. So we're gonna start with Ali Kosterich, and then we have Stephanie Gomez. So I'm going to ask Ali's advisor, Matt Weber, to introduce her officially. And so I'll turn the floor over to you, Matt.
So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Ali Kosterich, whose dissertation is entitled Rapid Institutional Change, Professional Journalists, and the Rise of the News Nerd. Before Ali gets up here, I was going to say, first of all, congratulations, but second of all, I am absolutely going to miss working with Ali. She's been a phenomenal graduate student to work with, the first graduate student that I am graduating. And point in case, just in the past month, we've had 2 articles accepted in press. Ali's currently leading a collaboration between Rutgers and the University of North Carolina on the third publication that we're currently working on. And we just spent an hour in my office talking about the next 3 or 4 articles that she's already got planned and is already working on. So it's really been amazing to see her. She's developed her career and built out that research trajectory. So with that, stage is yours.
Well, thanks for that introduction, and to everyone else for being here today. So my dissertation chronicles recent and rapid institutional change in the U.S. news industry. So it's past the shift from print news organizations to the web and the rise of digital native news organizations, and towards a focus on the development of news nerds, which is a term I use to describe a new form of professional journalist working at the intersection of news and data, analytics, and platform technologies. So there's a new form of professional journalists developing as news organizations hire programmers, coders, and data specialists and create teams dedicated solely to producing content for social media platforms and news applications. News organizations have expanded beyond the boundaries of the traditional journalist position, so from reporting and editing narrowly defined to incorporate these news nerds. And the titled and specific responsibilities of these news nerds vary, but the commonality is a driving force to produce more effective and efficient news by harnessing technological advancements, such as the rise and accessibility of big data, by harnessing computing technologies and mobile and social platforms. So news nerds and their output are dependent on specific technological skills, but they remain in the service of journalism and incorporated into the workflow of the established journalist profession. Now, there's a long history of journalism studies that examine digital transformation, but attention is only just beginning to be directed to the particular role of these new positions within the news industry, which are very indicative of the emergence of new forms of news work and new forms of professional journalists. So building on this history, recent transformation in the news industry has really challenged the fundamental notion of what it means to be a journalist, and so it requires new thinking around these change processes. So in order to better understand the changing nature of the professional journalist, my work is grounded in institutional theory, which has a specific focus on how professionals and industry-wide structures and norms more generally become taken for granted. An institutional approach to change provides a foundation for examining the relationship between external social, political, technological forces and organizational structures, such as a profession. So historically, professionals controlled their own fate and they determined their own definition and purview, but recent and rapid technological change has increased the influence of these external forces on work practices, processes, and professions in general. So it's worth noting that the majority of research on institutional change in professions takes a relatively long-term perspective, So few of the studies specifically attend to the possibility and, more importantly, the significance of institutional change processes that occur in a rapid time frame. And this gap in the research provides the theoretical focus of my dissertation, which is summarized with the first two research questions. So how does institutional change occur in a rapid time frame, and how does it differ from a traditional model of institutional change? And so the development of new forms of professional journalists provides a good context to investigate these dynamics of the news industry and of the process of rapid institutional change, as is summarized in research question 3, which looks at the changing composition of the journalist profession. And as you can see, there are several hypotheses regarding the dynamics of rapid institutional change at both the actor and the organizational levels. For the sake of time today, I'm going to focus more generally on these research questions, but please feel free to reach out if you're interested in the specific hypotheses and findings. So in order to examine this process of change and answer the research questions and test the hypotheses, I have a mixed method research design, and it has 3 components. So the first is a contextualization of rapid institutional change in the journalist profession, focusing specifically on the increasing prominence of news nerds. And the second is a case study of New York City news organizations, which provides a high-level view of the employment networks of these professional journalists over time. And the third is an integrated analysis of rapid institutional change, and the point, this is specifically aimed at identifying the factors that contribute to the likelihood that a journalist is a news nerd and the likelihood that a news organization is a leader in news nerds. So the first component of the research design seeks to model change, a process of rapid institutional change in the journalist profession through a qualitative analysis of interviews with 20 professional journalists and through a data set of archival materials from trade press and industry reports. All the materials were analyzed in parallel, first using a strategic narrative approach to generate a sequence of events, and then through a grounded theory approach to look for emergent themes guided by theory on institutional change. And so the findings from the first research component are structured according to the stages of institutional change. So institutional change begins when jolts emanating from social, technological, political forces disrupt a stabilized industry. So in the context of the US news industry, this is evident in the realities of newspaper circulation, revenue, and employment trends. We have the growing ubiquity of digital technologies, data, computational advancements, and the growing influence of social media companies and platforms that have really upended business models and production processes and organizational structures. Of course, we also have the associated changes in consumer behavior, so audiences finding and consuming news in an increasingly mediated, delivered by third parties and on mobile phones. And together, all of these changes have really jolted the established practices of the news industry, and then, of course, the status quo of what it means to be a professional journalist. So early efforts to adapt to disruption were generally unable to keep pace with all of the technological and social changes. In fact, many of the changes that undermine traditional news processes and practices actually served as the disruptions or the disruptive shocks that created this opportunity space for the emergence of new players into the industry. So there were new players emerging in the form of organizations, things like digital native news companies and social media companies, as well as in the form of actors bringing in new knowledge and experience and expertise into the industry. So, for example, the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern partnered with the Knight Foundation to create a scholarship program that was specifically aimed at bringing in web developers and software programmers into news organizations to kind of spur innovation and help solve problems more generally. And these new entrants came from outside the traditional boundaries of journalism, or of the journalism profession, and offered an alternative approach to the established practices and processes, kind of igniting the possibility of change of professional journalists and thus they represent this deinstitutionalization, which is the second stage of institutional change. So then we started to see discussions popping up among news industry professionals, discussions about data and applications, and generally as journalism more than just writers writing and editors editing. And we had the start of news nerd exploration and experimentation by legacy news organizations. And this stage also represents a time when organizations began to evaluate the utility of something new, again in this case of news nerds. So during this very early stage of the change process, there were a number of different conferences and symposia devoted to various aspects related to news nerds and their output. And these activities were all concrete reactions to this destabilization of the established practices of the news industry. And during this stage, much of the pre-institutionalization activities, it's important to note, were not central to the business models or the processes of the news organization. They were done in a much more ad hoc basis. So, within the context of the news industry, theorization occurs, for example, through several legitimization processes. So we have moral legitimacy, which is the nesting of something new with prevailing normative ideas. And within the news industry, this can be seen in the connection between news nerds and their associated skills, training, and expertise provided at the professional training grounds of journalism schools and style handbooks. And then we have pragmatic legitimacy, which is established through the relationship between news nerds and economic incentives, things related to audience traffic and audience engagement. And then we have cognitive legitimacy, which is established through vehicles like press coverage and external awards, like Pulitzers. And together, these theorization activities set up the next stage of institutional change, which is diffusion. So diffusion is the stage where news organizations would increasingly hire news nerds, and the community of news nerds becomes more visible. While this occurred at many of the national legacy print organizations and digital native news organizations, even a few regional print news organizations, there's still a significant lacking in the adoption of these news nerds, particularly at smaller local news organizations where budget and infrastructure and even culture would constrain kind of the adoption or even the experimentation with new forms of professional journalists. But the common thread among the news organizations with successfully integrated news nerd teams is this acknowledgement, a general acknowledgement at all levels within the newsroom that technical literacy and technical skills can really open the door to new forms of storytelling. So it's really this combination of the skills with the goals of storytelling. And in general, full institutionalization of news nerds as a taken for granted structure throughout the US news industry has yet to occur. And it seems then that this diffusion stage applies best to the current state of the field of news nerds in the US news industry. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit to the second research component, which looks at the composition of the journalist profession over time. A sample set of news organizations headquartered in New York City was generated as a case study. And the employment histories of these individual journalists at the sample news organizations were created by aggregating data from LinkedIn. So once all of the data were collected, they were immediately de-identified and anonymized. And then for each job history in the data set, and there were over 20,000, the organization and the position were coded. So each organization was coded by industry, and each position was coded on two levels. First, to reflect the general position, reporter, editor, writer, producer. And second, to further this understanding of the evolution of these news nerd positions versus traditional journalist positions. And these codes were created through an iterative process and verified through the interviews with professional journalists. So, social network analysis was used as the primary method on this component of the research design, and it enables the examination of the connection between two entities based on a common relationship. So this network visualization provides a view of the employment network based on journalist jobs and corresponding organizations in aggregate from 2011 through 2015. And as expected, organizations like ABC News, NBC News, Huffington Post occupy central positions in the network, as many employees pass through these organizations during their career working in the NYC News ecosystem. But the visualization also shows some unexpected intermediaries like NTV, Vice, Al Jazeera, occupying important positions in the network as well, and indicating that these companies have a lot of employee crossover with the sample news organizations. So at a more granular level, this analysis examines the development of news nerds as a new form of professional journalists, and this chart summarizes the general change in the number of new news nerd positions as a percentage of new journalist jobs each year. And according to the data from this case study, it's generally evident that there's been an upward trend with regards to the presence of news nerd jobs within the newsroom. And then I took all jobs that were coded as news nerd positions and connected them with the ties between journalists and organizations. And I ran a network measure to look at which organizations are most important in the network based on the number of connections they have in the network. So this is also known as degree centrality. Within the network of news nerds, the New York Times, and to a lesser extent the Wall Street Journal, are consistently more central. Over time, these organizations hire the greatest number of new news nerds and implicitly may be viewed as industry leaders. As the change process progressed, you can also see digital native news organizations beginning to play more of a central role in the news nerds network, with the inclusion of BuzzFeed and Mike towards the end. And then I also looked at the feeder industries of these news nerd jobs. So in general, there's not a large influx of news nerds from industries outside of news. Overall, only 30% of these jobs come from a different prior industry. And this indicates a small but noteworthy migration from other areas of expertise and reinforces this finding that the majority of these jobs are driven from within the news industry, even more so specifically as the change process progresses over time. And in part, this means that news nerds are being hired from within the industry and thus are more likely to come with familiar norms of the industry. But on the other hand, this also suggests that at this stage of institutional change, journalist hires are not necessarily bringing a fresh perspective to a given job. So in other words, while the early hires came from external industries, which might have actually accelerated the change process, current news nerd hires reinforce the existing practices of the news industry and the institutional influence of taken for granted routines. And this decrease in the diversity of industry experience over time is really reflective of the rapid institutional change process that has occurred. So, putting this all together, the first two research questions were trying to understand how institutional change occurs in a rapid time frame and how this process differs from the traditional model of institutional change. And they were examined through this case study, or through the analysis of the case of the journalist profession, which offers clear evidence of rapid institutional change with specific regard to the development of news nerds. Now, the process of rapid institutional change differs from the traditional model of institutional change in two significant ways. So first, full legitimization, which included the stabilization of cognitive legitimacy, occurred prior to complete diffusion. And in fact, complete diffusion has not yet occurred, which leads to the second important difference, which is the outcome. So according to the literature on institutional change processes in any context are a long-term process that results in either a binary option of institutionalization of this new thing as a taken for granted, natural and appropriate arrangement, or the failure of this new thing as a fleeting fad. And in the case of news nerds and the journalist profession, neither institutionalization nor failure occurred. And so in synthesizing these findings, I propose this idea of institutional augmentation as a way to better understand the process and the outcome of rapid institutional change. So simply put, institutional augmentation represents institutional change that occurs rapidly and results in neither the displacement of an existing institutional structure nor the failure of the new one. And instead, existing institutions are augmented to allow for the coexistence of supplementary institutions. So in practice, the institutionalization of news nerds would mean that there's no longer a distinction to be made between them and traditional journalists. At the most basic level, for example, this could be reflected in job titles. In other words, a data editor would be no different from a news editor, would be no different from an interactives editor. They would all just be editors using any tools necessary to tell the best stories and to get them in front of the right audiences. Clearly, however, this isn't the case in the U.S. news industry today. News nerds have not been institutionalized, but they also haven't failed as this trend or fleeting fad. Each of the stages of institutional change occurred, from disruption and the upending of established practices, to exploration and experimentation, to legitimization and diffusion to some extent, but the process still falls short of full institutionalization. So practically, it's reasonable to predict that news nerds serve and will continue to serve as an augmentation of professional journalists. So any journalist can be a news nerd, but not every journalist should be a news nerd. The journalist profession has actually augmented enough so that both can coexist without one displacing the other. Of course, there are several limitations to this study. So while the archival industry materials and the interviews were used to represent a cross-section of the news industry, the employment history data used in the second component of the research design doesn't capture the full scale of the industry. Instead, it builds from a sample of organizations in New York City, and thus can be biased to reflect a major news media market. A broader sample would capture a wider range of work histories and would more accurately reflect the change processes. The analysis is also based on data from an online professional social networking site. Again, this is referring specifically to the second research component. Profiles on social networking sites are not an agreed upon historical record. They're self-reported presentation of one's own work. There are different incentives for participating in these social networking sites. And these limitations can lead to estimation bias. But prior research suggests that these types of concerns can be mitigated with large enough sample sizes and with correlations among other data sources. This data set, the employment history data set, also has an inherent limitation with regards to the longitudinal analysis, so it's less complete with each prior year. And this is simply a factor of the way LinkedIn functions. If we go back to 2011, for example, which is the first year of data collection here, the BuzzFeed data set is only about 20% complete. So this method of data collection is limited as far as a snapshot of 2011, but it's also the best picture that we have available of this employment trajectory of these news nerds and of journalists more generally. So of course these data are not perfect, but with mixed method approach and the combination of a very wide variety of data sources reflecting different levels of perspective offers this robust picture from a place to analyze institutional change. And the triangulation of these findings, which I only saw two of, but further supports a confident assessment of the rapid institutional change process and the institutional augmentation specifically occurring in the journalist profession. So as the industry evolves, there's a number of avenues for future research. So building on this concept of institutional augmentation, I'm interested in engaging in an explication of this process in action. So specifically looking at how the boundaries and interactions between these coexisting institutional structures. This can be done with examining the daily activities, routines, responsibilities among these news nerds coexisting with traditional journalists. And this research could help shed light on any competition or negotiation that happens or that occurs as a result of institutional augmentation. I'm also interested in investigating the management of this type of change process. It seems from the interviews alone that there's a lot of contention here, so I'd be interested in exploring that further. And I'm also thinking about the effects of institutional augmentation on outcomes like the fates of organizations, of these individuals, and of society at large. So for example, even if news nerds serve as a supplementary form of professional journalists, these cultural or business consequences are still important. So any change in the agreed upon understanding of professional journalists can impact the production of news, it can impact news organization performance, and it can impact public perception of news more generally. So the net effect on the role of news in the public sphere has yet to be determined. And that's all for now. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to your
feedback. Questions?
Hi, Alan. Thanks very much. That's a really impressive dissertation. I just thought of classical triangulation, so I was really happy to see it be done. However, I have a question. You have a new model that you say of institutional change that you say is due to rapidity. And I wonder if you've considered that it's, rather than due to rapidity, it's due to the nature of the institution that you're studying and how that particular institution has changed. And the reason I think about that is I look at, you know, that degree of centrality of where people came from, and also the early indication of the decrease in employment of print journalists and the increase, okay, those numbers seem to add up to the same thing, right? So it seems to me that this is a very particular sort of institution and institutional change. So maybe you might think about seeing whether this model of rapidity looks the same in another type of institution rather than within the same institution.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about is how to kind of extrapolate this to other industries and thinking about examples. I don't have the data numbers on these, but we've been talking about things like electric cars and how when they were first introduced it was supposed to displace, you know, the traditional gasoline vehicle, and yet they still have not failed. And perhaps that's due to the length of time, but also an understanding of that when we talk about institutional change and change at such a significant level, it can end in this, you know, result of two things coexisting and make, you know, an augmentation where there's room for two institutions to be both taken for granted as options. But the point about the print news journalists decreasing, even while these increase, is for sure very interesting and something I'm thinking about kind of taking a little bit further.
Well done, Ellie. That's really a lovely piece of work too, and I support Nick there. I'm really interested to hear, where do you think all of this is going? I know now we're asking you to put on your prophetic glasses. I'm just curious, you know, where do you see this going, and what, or first of all, what is the implication of your work, and just at a broader level, where is this going?
So I think specifically in the news industry, we're obviously at a really important time, a significant time where this change is occurring. And I think it's reasonable to expect or to predict that these two structures, professional structures, will coexist, and that's due to all these external forces, you know, technological forces and economic realities and social behavioral changes due, you know, being impacted by the technological change. And obviously, this drive that there is still this prevailing norm of the industry to tell stories efficiently and effectively and to reach the right audience. And I think as long as that's still the prevailing norm, all of these tools can be used to better serve that norm, and I think that's what will be, I feel safe predicting that that will be for at least the near future.
Okay, well, thank you, Ellie.
Thank you.
We do have for you a small gift from the PhD program. So congratulations on finishing your dissertation. We're very proud to call you an alumni of the SKY program. So, why don't we take a quick break, get another snack, go to the bathroom, and when we reconvene, we'll hear from Stephanie Gomez about her dissertation project. Okay?
Nice to see you.
I was going to say, Rabbi. Few minutes ago. Oh, sure, I'm enjoying it. I'm very glad.
Yeah, the vendors have all been contacted. Thank you for getting those cards.
Yeah.
About a big first freshman.
Martina wants to know if SCLC is going to sponsor Did you see what John Eric?
Yeah.
That's registration.
Yeah, why is that not going to I mean, all of that is the same thing.
No, it doesn't make any sense.
I think Michael Field said he's going to sponsor. This has been a lot of work. Next time, or next.
I haven't heard back from any of the vendors yet.
I have a question for you also. So then all the and so I wanted to just tell you that we have we're going to do it Monday night, and then all the
No, she's working. She had to be on call, so I dumped her at the student center. She's been here for all last week.
How long has she been seeing you?
She's going tomorrow.
Okay.
Physically, we're both in New Jersey.
And so she goes back to Korea, or she?
No, she lives in San Francisco.
Oh, okay, okay, good.
Yeah.
Good, well, that's nice.
But it's one of those things, when your sister's here, she's here.
Right.
When she's away,
Yeah.
the bond grows bigger, but.
Right, right, yeah. Sibling relations, very interesting. Jen, how is your dog? She's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She got her stitches out?
Her stitches out yesterday.
Yay!
She's recovering. I had texted Marie this morning because, well, at noon, I locked myself out of the house this morning as I was leaving for school. So, like, we enter and leave through my office, and my car keys were on my desk, and I, put all my stuff together, I had my wallet and my phone, and someone texted me, and so I was, reading the text, and just sort of mindlessly locked the door and walked out, and was like, oh, my keys are on my desk. And so she could hear me, outside, and so just barking the whole time, trying to get in the house. So then when I finally got it, the locksmith came, I got into the house, and she was like, good, you're home. And then she was very sad that I ran right out the gate.
My mom was texting me that she found Sammy self-jailing himself in his house. Which, you know, he was doing that. And I was like, no, it's okay, fun. He was like, in and out.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, something, what did you do?
Yeah.
And she later found one of her Crocs
Oh no.
and hidden all the way out in the bushes in the backyard. So cute. So.
Yeah, our dog, she needs to eat shoes too. She normally sleeps in our bedroom when she's not injured. And one day we woke up and she got really sick and it didn't look like normal movement. And I was like, what is this? She'd eaten a sock or something. Like I got up and I'm like, she's gonna be fine. I had like a pair of slippers and she ate the entire top off. All like the leather, the fur, the only thing that was left was the rubber sole of it.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But it's so funny, like, Sammy rarely chews shoes, and he'll do it maybe like once a year or something.
Yeah.
So, I'm happy to have dogs.
Oh, okay. It was a rare thing for my dog. She doesn't normally destroy shoes, but she does like to steal them. It's her way of getting attention. She must have been mad at us today. Wanted to eat my slippers. Did your family come back? They're not here yet. Okay. Okay. People are out. Maybe. They won't remember what was that. Yeah, they know that you're very interested. How old are you? Almost. Yeah, right. Have personalities. We need to be back here after. I can start. Hopefully they'll come. Yeah, whoever's here, we can get them to switch over.
That's what I didn't have my social card, so I took that. Well, either way, I got it, so I brought it in, I think it was like Monday or Monday. Yes.
Good to see you.
Like I know yeah, that's what, like, you should be in there, I don't know why. You got yours?
I'll take it to service. Okay, just what we
I got mine from Apple, which I didn't think was in chocolate. Really? Yeah. Right, thank you. I mean, there's
Thank you so much. I know, I think everybody's
Right.
once you've got the tax and sort of separate
learn about taxation responsibility.
That's like, I told you that one time, I thought we were going to do it Monday night for people. Like, because you don't want to come to us about and okay with it not being able to code. I mean, she was telling me I'm okay with you doing
Any way that you can build in, because the little girls.
Do you want me to move? I'm willing to move up. Perfectly fine.
Here, see, you're gonna sit over here, okay? Let me get, sorry, I was. Okay, but if they start fussing it over, we'll just take it. Ready to reconvene here for our second dissertation presentation from Stephanie Gomez. So to introduce Stephanie properly, I'll ask Marie to come up and say a couple of words about her.
Okay, thank you, Pam. So, you know, as Matt was saying, it's a really truly a moment of joy when one of your students stands up here with a public presentation. Dr. Gomez and I have been working together for quite a while. She started here as a master's student and was in my class. One of my classes was called Interpersonal Communication for Information Professionals. I can't remember my own course. I will never be able to remember the title of her dissertation. And Stephanie was in my course and said she got this really keen interest in both communication and in library context. And so when she joined the PhD program, she actually joined as half COM and half LIS. And I also have to mention, you can put on your biography, but Stephanie was partially funded by the IMLS Spectrum Fellowship. This is a national program, highly competitive, where students who are from certain ethnic groups are eligible for extra funding. And so she came with as a Spectrum Fellow. Then something happened in Stephanie's life, actually in the audience, here today, her two lovely daughters. And she had a little hiatus, but now came back really strong to finish with an amazing dissertation. She's going to tell you all about it. The work that she's done is not actually, we found no evidence in the LIS research literature, which she'll talk about, that this kind of in-depth study has been done, almost an ethnography of 8 families. And so her topic has to do with teens and their use of ICT devices and how they negotiate that through their parents when they're not actually in charge of their own, they're really not in charge of their own ability to have, their smartphones and Wi-Fi and all those kind of connectivity. They're dependent on family, and family rules and regulations and so forth. So I think I'll just stop here and call Stephanie up and she can tell you about her interdisciplinary work.
Okay, hi, I'm Stephanie Gomez. This is my public presentation. My dissertation is entitled Information Practices Relative to Parental Mediation in the Family Context Among Puerto Rican and Dominican Teens. So I was really interested in teens negotiation and parental mediation being the parenting practices around teens' access to technology. As teens develop, they want to seek more of their interests and their priorities, and now that everything's being done on technology for the most part, their parents have more access and their information communication is more visible to their parents. And this is on top of parents and teens often have very different opinions about what parents should have a right to participate with, view, and access. So the practices that parents choose, and also the structures of the house, the physical spaces, the amount of devices, how these devices are accessed, all influence how teens, the practices the teens develop. So I was interested in how teens negotiated all these structures, and also the dynamic that developed between parents and teens. So my research questions here are Q1, how do Latino parents mediate their teens' information communication technology practices? RQ2, how do Latino teens negotiate their use of ICT in accordance with the family small world? And that's separated into two different sections, how they negotiate their resources then in accordance with their families, and how they negotiate their interpersonal relationships. So in order to investigate this or start looking at this, I did a literature review that looked into many different literatures, many different areas of research. It was covered a breadth of different fields, from library and information science, communication, psychology, human-computer interaction, and media and cultural studies. And these research is all related, but they were spread out all over a whole bunch of different places, so different fields. There were three main gaps that I identified, and this, in the mediation literature, the relationship between mediation and parenting practices within the context of the culture of the home, and then how teens' information behaviors were influenced by parents in the family context, and the actual practices that they developed in relation to negotiate the family. So the most important theoretical contributions to both the design and the analysis of the data was Chapman's Small World Theories, Silverstone and colleagues' Domestication of the Technology, and Nardi O'Day's Information Ecologies. Information ecologies helped me look at the household information network as an infrastructure of habitual practices between people and technology and values. But they didn't really have any mechanism of looking at the social aspects of the group, of the culture that developed in the home. And so that's where domestication of technology, they really look at the family as a cultural unit. And they provide tools to do that with the idea of family mythologies and looking at the stories that families tell about themselves. Small World Theories is more about than the individual within the group. She was interested in how the individual was constrained by their membership in their group, and I thought that this helped me bring in information access and literacy into the whole dynamic of which I was looking at in the home. So I recruited participants from Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is actually 43% Hispanic, Latino, and growing. Those are actually old census numbers that haven't been updated. I recruited from local organizations, Literacy Center, the public libraries, after-school programs, and also snowball sampling. The requirements were that they be 14 to 16-year-old teens in the family. I wanted to narrow the sample down to families that had teens in middle adolescence. They needed to have a parent of Latin American descent that speaks Spanish, because I wanted to bring in Latinos into the study. They hadn't really been looked into in library and information science. But then I look at the culture in different ways within the household, and so I'll explain again. And they had to have access to some activities at home, because I wanted to look at their actual negotiation of the physical spaces and the devices. So I found recruited 8 families. 2 were Puerto Rican and 6 were Dominican families, although one of the Dominican families had actually spent most of their lives in Puerto Rico. And they varied wildly demographics. So they were very different families, from education, socioeconomics, to family structure. I come at the study from a social constructivist point of view that sees information as meaning-making and individuals' experience of reality as something that they construct in the moment, an interpretation of their circumstances. To do this study then, to get a multi-perspective, I used mostly qualitative methods, surveys of family members, in-home family interview, a team mapping activity, individual interviews with both parents and teens, and I did this in each family. Some kind of general findings. And it was a very small sample with a really big deal of demographic variety. So you have to take that into consideration. But considering that, it was striking how family-centered they were, and the strong social roles that had developed in the home, so that around power. So parents were the authority, and teens saw their parents as legitimately having that authority. The teens complied with rules, they followed rules, they returned social communications, they respected their authority, and they had very few negative opinions, or at least they didn't think that parents did not have a right to the restrictions, to the monitoring that they did. The concepts influenced the teens' ICT use in very interesting ways, because it didn't necessarily happen where socioeconomics led to less competence, or that very educated parents led to more competence, because the teens actually took up roles in these families, so that in some of the families with less means, then the teens developed more competence in order to take care of their parents, and were a broker for their parents. So from the interviews, the family interviews, parents and teen interviews, I developed a typology of the parental mediation practices that were being used in the home. Some of these practices are similar to what has already been put forward in the parental mediation literature, but others are added, and a lot of sub-things have been added in order to better reflect what was represented in the data. Traditionally, parental mediation has been looked at as the practices that parents use to negate the negative effects of media. and they're seen as kind of these discrete practices. But this wasn't really how they existed within the home. They were completely intertwined with parenting practices, so regular parenting practices, so that sometimes practices were simply about restricting teens, screen time, technical restrictions, that sort of thing. But a lot of times they had different rules that then, such as bedtimes or restrictions on socialization outside of the house, that actually really influenced the teens' interactions as well. And there are also practices that it was difficult to decipher, is this really about the technology or is this about parenting? And it has been talked about within as separate, and so it's important that they come together. The parents tended to balance different practices, so that they used pieces of one kind of monitoring and a different kind of privacy. So they how they combined these practices then was very dependent on, seemed to be integrated in within the narratives that they told about themselves, the various combinations. So, so the narratives, which is taken from Silverstone's family mythologies, though I changed it to directed narratives because parents also had, it wasn't just shared family meaning, it was also parents' personal stories about themselves and their identity as parents and their identity in relation to technology. But these narratives provided rationale for both restrictions and for the freedoms that they gave their teens. And they were embedded within their personal context, so that, for instance, this family lived in a dangerous neighborhood, at least what they considered to be a dangerous neighborhood. And also, it's a family of 6 kids, and little extra money for technology. And all these come in together then with the stories that they tell about themselves and what their priorities become. So even though they didn't have a lot of extra funds for technology, they prioritized it because they didn't want the teens to go out, or the teen or the siblings to go outside of the house, because they saw the world and the neighborhood as very dangerous. So you see there's a lot of things going on in this statement here. The mom thinks the world is dangerous. She wants to be a good parent. She wants to protect her kids. She sees her son's friends as bad influences. And the only way to protect them is to keep them inside. Technology she sees as a viable alternative to social interaction, to in-person social interactions. And she also values her son's happiness, so then she provided her son with a lot of freedom and a lot of technology in order to divert his attention inside. So she balanced these extra freedoms with the restrictions that they had as well. So as I was talking about before with the teenagers, there were gaps in what the influences on teenagers' practices were within the home and parents, and also what were the practices? What practices did teens use to negotiate their families and their parents? So, for instance, here, physical spaces. This is part of the typology that was developed for the teens. This is the aspect that deals with resources, and there you see the number of teams that were categorized within each theme, and then the number of codes within those categories. So there were 8 teams in the study, so that gives you an idea. So with physical spaces, the teens arranged space in order to be, a lot of the teens arranged space to be alone in space, and they did this by taking advantage of the spaces as they became available. And some of this was planned activity, as in they knew their other family members' schedules and activities and personal habits. But then they were also impulsive based on the current circumstances and their current present needs. The teens tended to have locations in the home where they centralized their technology use, where they would use the technology there if all was well and they were able to. And some of the teens tended to have a cycle of responsibility where they would leave the room, leave the space or leave the room to fulfill some kind of responsibility in the home, and then they would come back to the space, and then they would do this throughout the day as their parents asked them to do certain things. So with devices, whether they shared devices, owned devices, borrowed devices, or whether they were broke, this all influenced how they interacted with them. So, for instance, when teens shared devices, they tended to either claim them, it's my turn, I have dibs, or dominate them. When they dominated them, they used them all the time so that these devices did not appear available to other family members ever. And so then the other family members had to ask them to use the device. And this asking seemed to have an influence or a restricting quality on interactions with technology, in that, so when teens actually were wanting to borrow devices, they attempted to use any other means before they asked the family member to borrow that device. So that a lot of the teens, even though they have a lot of technology in their house, it belongs to other people. So they're mostly using their smartphone instead of their parents' laptops. And also when they used those devices, the ones that they borrowed, they tended to restrict their activities to the interactions that they had asked permission for. The teens tried to constrict their content, their use of content and certain interactions to what they felt their parents would approve of. And this was very vague, so they kind of went on what they believed their parents would approve of, and this kind of gave them a certain amount of leeway, and also whether it specifically their parents had told them no on that specific thing. So, for instance, one teenager who didn't have a smartphone, she also wasn't allowed to she wasn't allowed to make a profile on social media. But then instead, so she used all of her friends' profiles, and when they were all together, she said, "Well, I'm the one that gets on, and let's take a picture. Let's do all that. Let's all post to Snapchat. Let me do this. Let me do." So she wanted to keep up with everybody and participate as was expected of her, but she wasn't breaking her mom's rule. So teenagers also had ways that they negotiated their interpersonal practices. So being in the home, as we've been talking about, they needed to negotiate parental authority a lot. They did this in relation to technology. They wanted to earn more extra time. So they did this by earning leeway, which was like following rules, fulfilling responsibilities, picking up communications. They also didn't hide. They didn't hide on purpose in order to not appear as if they were hiding or isolating themselves. Because parents and teens saw isolation as suspect. And the teens did push their boundaries a little bit, these tended to be small verbal, 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, this isn't fair. They were very innocent boundary pushing. Can I have this technology? There was, at this point in the time of the interviews, there was not very large conflicts. They were very innocently, slowly pushing their boundaries. Teens also needed to negotiate their social worlds. Different social worlds had different expectations, possibly from what their parents had or what their homes had available. So specifically for the teens, it was their peer and their academic worlds. Peers expected them to participate in social media, to have a smartphone, and the academic worlds, they were expected to print their homework or their assignments, and to type them, and to receive communications from parents or from teachers about something they had forgotten, that sort of thing. So teens, they used outside devices, social capital, so to ask their friends, can you do this for me? Interpersonal conversations, go up to a teacher and say, I can't do this, will you do this for me? Can you put it on the list? How do I get around this? Or with their friends, can you put that down and just pay attention to me? The teens also had, it seemed as they spoke, that they had mental ways of framing the constraints that made it easier for them to accept their circumstances. So a positive frame would be the teen that didn't have a smartphone, her talking about, well then, that means that I don't have the pressure to interact continuously, and so this is good. I don't have any of the drama. She said, no drama. With acclimating, it's like, okay, well, this, I don't like this, but I'm used to it. No control. Well, I don't like this, but I don't have any control over the situation, and so I can't do anything. There were two teams that used a future frame, which projected themselves into the future with technology in this positive, successful way. And so that helped them accept what they had right now, and also kind of prepare for the specific future that they saw, which was a professional gamer and a software engineer, the ones that I'm thinking of. And social media is actually where this all started, because I wanted to extend the social privacy research, which looks at teens and how they found privacy online with multiple audiences, with their friends and their teachers and their parents all on Facebook, for instance. And so I wanted to extend that to more specifically look at the family and parents and into the physical environment. Teens did use some of the practices that is discussed, like encoding texts or encoding posts and censoring their posts. But they also had to deal with parents' posts about them that presented them in ways that they did not want to be seen. And so they needed to negotiate that. Would you take this down? Can you not post about me? And all their parents' friends, the social network then extended their parents' monitoring to a much greater degree, and meant that they had to follow social norms that were even beyond what their parents might set for them. And yeah, so that is pretty much coming to the end. I have just a slide of contributions about bringing parental mediation into library and information science and its usefulness there, because it's already a big body of literature, but that parental mediation needs to be considered within parenting itself. And I developed these typologies of simple practices that other researchers can build on, and extended the social privacy research beyond to the family context and the physical environment. And yeah, and so that's about it. And any questions?
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk more about why you chose to look at Puerto Rican and Dominican families specifically, and then also how you think your findings with this particular group might be similar to or different from teens in other groups.
Well, it's hard to say because the sample is so small, and so as you saw, it was a very family-centered, and so across all the demographics, even though there were big variations, they had similar types of orientations to authority, but I chose to look at Latinos because, and Latinos were a big variation because Latinos often get looked at in the research as just low socioeconomics or just low education, and so I wanted to look at the variation within the population. Is that good?
Since you had such a small sample size from a fairly large geographic area, I was just wondering if there was any overlap between the social networks of the individuals involved, either the families or the teens, or maybe you didn't even look at that, I don't know.
Well, I didn't really look, but there were some snowball sampling for the last, or for two in the middle, so they kind of overlapped a little, but they were mostly found from different organizations, so I guess the area was broad enough that, but I didn't look at their social networks.
Just wondering if that may have had any influence on the study overall, if half of them knew one another or not.
Yeah. The two lived together, actually. Two families lived together. They were actually the families with parents with the most education and the most affluent, so that was interesting. But, and then two other families, it was a snowball, but so the two families that lived together, they definitely overlapped completely. They had the same bedroom, but they had the same bedroom, same family in Dominican Republic. So, but beyond that, I don't know, because I didn't look at their Facebook. I didn't include that or their Snapchats or.
I may have missed this, but did you interview the parents and the children together or separately?
Separately.
Separately, okay. So I was wondering about that when the teens were talking about all the things that the parents knew that they were doing that and how they may have responded, so, okay.
There was also a family interview.
There was a family interview and then there was an individual, and they were done in private. Except for one, but that team didn't seem to be less open. And I definitely think that they didn't show me the extent of their content. I had two moms that talked about their kids using or catching their kids with porn on their phones, and those two teens didn't talk to me about it. I don't think that that's weird. And actually, it was interesting. The teens very much, they wanted to tell their stories, and they were really detailed. And it seemed they were. Most of them, they were kind of moved by the experience, which was really surprising to me. If somebody was paying that much attention to them.
Do you think that I'm sorry, Nick. Do you think that the teens, if they were moved by that, sort of understand their parents' motivations better as a result of that? That maybe they'll cut their parents some slack when the parents are like, no, screen time's done, no more, no social networking or something like that. I mean, do the teens sort of, I don't know if you talked to them about that, but I'm wondering if this experience helps them to sort of get it, why their parents do the things that they do in terms of controlling access.
I don't know if this experience influenced that, but the teens seem to have a very good idea of that already. They didn't see their parents as having bad intentions. They saw their parents as doing these things because for their safety or for them and within their rights too.
Do you have any feeling for the extent to which the cultural context influences the results? I mean,
The cultural
are these
context of
things
the
general,
whole, or
or-
you're talking about Latinos specifically?
Yes, well, that's what you said. I mean,
well,
that's the cultural context that you use.
Because I looked at the families within as the cultural unit. So I was looking at the family as a culture to develop within itself. So I wanted to look at Latinos, not as in what we think Latinos are, but what are the practices that this family used that are related somehow. And so then low English proficiency, because this was a group of first generation Americans or first generation immigrants. I'm hesitant to say, but the family centered, and the respect for parents. I mean, that seemed to be across the whole sample, and it didn't depend on socioeconomics or education or parenting style. The parents that were very permissive, the teens still respected their parents' authority. The teens that had parents that were authoritative or authoritarian, they didn't have this negative opinion. And I think, I mean, it's really necessary to do a much bigger sample, and then maybe to separate and do socioeconomics and education.
Yeah, I just wonder to what, I mean, it's a very, as you said, it's very specific, right? And so the question that I really have is, to what extent the mediation practices, right, might be the same in other contexts, right?
Our children from, Caucasian families as likely to respect their parents, influence as a culture where, parents are given more respect.
So within the literature, the majority culture teens are less likely, and the more Americanized the teen, they are less likely to respect their parents or to not push the boundaries.
I think this was an interesting finding for Steph because, well, first of all, there's so little we know about. I mean, there's really little. It's very exciting to do this in-depth thing to find out, what's actually going on. And Stephanie didn't mention, of course, she's fluent in Spanish, and a lot of the interviews were conducted in Spanish. And then the role of, brokerage with the kids and stuff. But one of the things I think that was really interesting is this was kind of a little bit of a surprise, I think. We Steph expected that there would be more pushback, right?
I started because I wanted to look at privacy and what kids were doing to get away. That's where I started. So yeah, absolutely. I was like, yeah. And then it just kept going on. And I think, and I didn't like that I didn't have a conflict family within, because I think that really limited it, but then it's also interesting that I didn't.
So lots of, I think that one of the contributions too is to lay some groundwork, especially applying these different theoretical frameworks that haven't been done. But I wonder, I do have a question. You can't imagine that I might have any questions. Questions she had. To talk a little bit about the challenge of this much qualitative, even though 8 families, there was an enormous amount of qualitative data.
Yeah, the transcriptions were like 900 pages of transcription. Yeah, it was a lot, and
the first draft was 1,200 pages.
Yeah, my first draft was very long. If I were to do it again, I wouldn't do. I had a code book that I started with, and I think that I got really a little paralyzed within the code book because I was trying so hard to fit it in with what I already thought. And so, yeah, I found that limiting, and also, for some reason, it seemed like it should make it go quicker, but it made it go much slower. And I actually then developed a whole new code book and reanalyzed the data 2 more times. And
thinking about what you said about how you were surprised that the teens weren't more, didn't have more pushback. From a communication perspective, so there's a big communication privacy management theory, looks a lot at families and how there's some research on teens and how they want to protect their private information from their parents finding out about stuff. And so I wonder if you might find a little slightly different reaction among teens, instead of thinking of their parents as gatekeepers to the information, instead of that, thinking of themselves as gatekeepers to their parents, from finding out about, what they're doing with their friends or what they're posting about online, and wanting to maintain a privacy boundary around what they perceive to be their own information that they're sharing, as opposed to other information that they want access to.
Yeah, I was pretty disappointed that I couldn't really tell that from the data, because I did want to look at disclosure practices, but yeah, it didn't really come out.
Yeah. Next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious if so the families, between the parents and the children, do they communicate in English or in Spanish or both, or?
Everything, and it depends.
Sure.
So, like in big families, often the oldest would go back and forth, and they were super fluent, and then the youngest barely knew any Spanish at all. So even within the same family, there could be a lot of variability.
I'm just wondering if the degree of fluency in either one of these two languages might either hinder or encourage more active communication between parents or among siblings or with children that might interfere with their technology use.
Well, one teen who had the most responsibility for his parents and probably had the lowest English proficiency and technical proficiency, he did talk about hiding in public. So he didn't use the word hiding, but he didn't think that his parents had any idea of what he was doing because they didn't know anything, basically. That's actually what he said. They don't know nothing, basically. So yeah, in that family, yeah. But it's hard to say because there was such variation.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. And we do have a small gift for you also from the PhD program, so congratulations for becoming a Dr. Gomez. And best of luck to you. All right, thanks everyone for coming out for Colloquium.